Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture, we are gonna talk about the equals method in Java. Let's create a class here. I'm gonna call this class laptop. Now I'll give laptop a couple of fields. So I'm gonna say private int ID and private string brand. And I'll give it a constructor. Right-click. Go to source. Generate constructor using fields. I'll check the fields that I want to include as parameters of the constructor, and then click OK. Let's get rid of the super, which is actually unnecessary. I'll also create a toString method. So I'm going to right-click, go to Source, Generate toString. Check the fields that I want to include, and click OK. So now I'm going to create two laptop objects, and I'm going to talk about how to compare those two laptop objects. So let's say laptop1 equals new laptop. Let's give it an ID of 250. Let's say the brand is HP. And the other object, laptop2 equals new laptop. Let's give it an ID of 90 and a Dell brand. Are these two laptops equal or not? If we want to know whether they are equal or not, we could do this. We could say sysout control space. Let's say laptop1 equals laptop2. So we're comparing them with equals equals. And if I run this, it's gonna output false because they are clearly different objects. Now, what equals equals does is it tells you whether two references to objects are pointing at the same object or not. Or with primitive types, it tells you if those primitive types have the same value. But with non-primitive types like references to objects, tells you if they're pointing at the same object or not. So if I point laptop2 at laptop1, then it's going to say that they are equal, so it outputs true. Thus, when two objects are equal, it has nothing to do with whether they are literally the same object or not. For example, if a laptop object has the same ID and brand, we might argue that they should be considered equal. And that's what ID.equals method is for. So let's change them so they are both equal in terms of meaning. So we've given them the same ID and the same brand. If I run this, equals equals still gives us false because these are two different objects. They contain the same information and we feel that they are the same, but in terms of memory, they are kind of physically two different objects. So how can we compare them in terms of meaning? And what we should do is, we use .equals, which is a method that all objects inherit from the object superclass, and we can override this method to provide our own interpretation of it. If I just run this, it's gonna still say false because we haven't told .equals how to compare these two objects, and we can do that by overriding .equals and implementing it ourselves. The easiest way to do that is to right-click in your class, go to Source, then generate hashcode and equals, and we'll talk about hashcode in a little bit. And then tick the fields that you want to compare. So if you think that two laptop objects with the same brand are equal regardless of ID, then just tick brand. Or if you think that having the same ID means they are equal regardless of brand, then just tick ID. Well, hopefully you got the idea. that you need to tick fields that are important in comparing the object. If you think that in this case, two objects must have the same ID and the same brand in order to be considered equal, then you tick both. If you have a lot of fields, you only tick the ones that are important when you compare the objects. So I'll tick both here, and I'll click OK, and it generates this dot equals method for me. And all this is doing is it's trying to compare the two objects efficiently. So it does a load of tests, but it is actually just saying, is this object equal to this object? And that's all it's doing. So now if I run this, dot equals will output true because our objects are equal. And if I change brand, for example, or ID, then they're gonna be false because I ticked both ID and brand. So they must have the same ID and the same brand to be considered equal. So that's dot equals method. However, with primitives, you can just use equals equals to compare them. Let's do an integer value. Let's say first number equals 8. And integer, second number also equals 8. So let's say first number equals second number. Let's run this. And it does work, it outputs true. So you have to be a bit careful here. Keep in mind, equals equals is only checking if two references are pointing literally at the same object. And the safe way is to use dot equals, which will tell you if they're equal in terms of value or not. Now the tricky part is, when it comes to strings, a common beginner's mistake is to compare two strings with equals equals. Let's create two strings here. So string A equals yes, and string B equals yes as well. And let's try that. Let's say this out. A equals equals B. Now what do you think? It's gonna be equal or not? If you run this, they are pointing at the same string. And that's because Java points these two references at the exact same object. So keep it in mind that you should not compare non-primitives with equals equals. Only use equals equals to check if two references point at the same object. And the same with strings. Always use dot equals to compare strings, because this will play you false. Equals equals is only checking if these references are literally pointing at the same object or not. And to show you what I mean, let's add some more characters to this. And then let's do substring on it. I'll say dot substring, start index 0 and index third character. And then do a sysout. Now let's output string B and run this. And what we find is that B is equal to yes, because we added more characters to the string. But then we only took the first 3 characters of that, so it is yes again. And string B is equal to yes. Therefore, the equals equals is not giving correct result. While it's actually doing what it should do, it's telling us that these references point to different objects in memory. And for that reason, what you should do is always use dot equals with strings. Thus, you cannot rely on equals equals, because you really need to compare strings in terms of the data they contain. And for that, you need dot equals. So equals equals is to check if you've got literally the same object, whilst dot equals is for comparing in terms of meaning. which is what you almost always want with strings. And as we've seen, you can implement your own equals method just by getting your IDE to do it for you. I just want to very quickly mention this hash code method that was also generated for us. If you take an object that doesn't have a toString method, you will see this output. Let's try this and say sysout control space new object. I'll run that and you will see this ID here. If this had a toString method that actually would implement it to return something other than the default, then we wouldn't see this. But by default, the parent object outputs this stuff. And this is the class of the object, including the package that it's in. This is just an @sign. And this looks like a memory address, but it's not. It's what's called a hash code. And hash codes are just unique ID that each object has. And it's actually literally the value returned by this hash code method here. So that's it for equals method, and that's the end of this lecture. Until next time, keep practicing.